Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today's Thursday, October 3rd, 2019. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story skyscraper that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint on the afternoon of 9/11 in under 7 seconds. Before we go further, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hey, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. So just to let everyone know, I'm here to help with any technical glitches which occur from time to time. And also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. You just submit them in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. And just a quick note to Richard, I can actually see you on the screen, so this might be a new feature and it might not be, but in case it's not, you can resolve it, and if it is, then everybody enjoy.
Yeah, I thought I'd talk directly to our listening folks there and see how this goes instead of being a disembodied voice in the background. If it doesn't work for us or we get glitches and stuff, we'll figure something else out. But before we go too much farther, let me tell you something about my background here. I have been working with the San Francisco Bay Area, working on these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums. Most recent project. This also, after that, the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full time onto this important outreach effort of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, parking structure, and mid rise office space, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. And let's get right into it, though. World Trade Center Building 7. Did you know about it? Most architects and engineers don't even know about the third worst structural failure in modern history. So this is a travesty. I mean, there are buildings similarly built, so this becomes quite a problem for us, as you'll see. But let's tell you about it. It's a 47-story skyscraper, about a football field away from the North Tower. It was not hit by an airplane. This is not an insignificant building. It's the tallest building in most of our states. Here it is, just across the street from the Building 6, just outside the zone of the super block called the World Trade Center. And but it is part of the complex. Now, it's certainly a notable building, and as you see here, it is still standing after the collapse of the Twin Towers. It was hit by some of the debris from the towers, and it was it collapsed nevertheless, as I mentioned, in 7 seconds. Let's just look at that collapse. See what happens here. And it's 6 seconds prior to the overall collapse. You see the east penthouse collapsed, and then the whole building comes down, actually smoothly, uniformly, in terms of its collapse. The internet slows it down somewhat. But we're going to get into this. But first, what's the official story tell us about this? Here's Sham Sunder from NIST.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Primarily due to fires. What fires? Well, these fires. They're few, they're small, and they're scattered. As you can see, these are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in these buildings. And so this 12th floor up above is the part where NIST focuses their effort to uh, identify an initiation of collapse zone. Here, there are fires burning in the northeast section of the 12th floor about 2:30 and 3 o'clock. They're moving already over toward the east. So NIST focuses its initiation of collapse around this column 79 because it's under the east penthouse, which you saw collapse 6 seconds prior to the overall building. Now, the problem is that NIST's fire simulation in their final report shows that this fire was burning for about an hour or more, hour and a half, just prior to the collapse in this area. Now, that's a problem for a few reasons. One of them is that the they contradict themselves that the fires don't last in any one location for more than 20 or 30 minutes. So how's that fire hanging around column 79? Also, the photos show that that fire is gone in that area well over an hour before, up to an hour and a half before this the collapse of this building. So fires could not have caused the collapse. More likely, those fires were doing this. They're around column 79, according to the photos, about 3 p.m. And then they're moving on. By 4 p.m., they're certainly well toward the east and gone by 5 p.m., which is even 20 minutes before the collapse. So we have already a series of significant problems associated with the NIST report. But let's go on with the official story here.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Okay, for the first time, a brand new phenomenon.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining columns.
So there's a whole series of events that happen here around the 12th to the 14th floor that cause this collapse. What's their theory? Well, these long span beams are heated up for the hour and a half prior to this building's collapse, pushing this girder off of its seat on this column 79, allowing floor 13 to fall on 12, which causes a progressive collapse to 12 on 11, so on for 9 floors, indicating then having the collapse be completely rising all the way up to the top of the building in this instability, and then traveling laterally across the building as the building is then coming down at free fall acceleration, which we'll get to. There's a number of problems associated with all of this. First of all, we showed you that the fires aren't burning here an hour and a half before the collapse, so they couldn't have been thermally expanding at the time of the collapse, pushing this girder off of its seat. The beams are fireproofed, as you can see halfway through construction in this video, in this photo. So they're fireproofed with 2-hour fire protection. That's a lot more fire protection than they would ever need, because fire only has enough fuel to burn 20 or 30 minutes, even according to NIST. But they say that these beams expanded, pushing this girder off of its seat. Well, this girder has what? Shear studs tying it very firmly, securely to the structural slab up above, which is with 30 shear studs, which are shown in the shop drawings here. So we have a problem there, but let's say that could have happened and this girder could have pushed sideways. Well, it would have had to have been pushed all the way off of its plate. Why? Because there are stiffeners supporting that bottom flange. So that girder would have had to have been pushed all 12 inches off of its seat. But NIST omits that stiffener. What do I mean? They omit this key piece of structural support for that flange, saying that the girder only had to be pushed halfway off of its seat, at which time this bottom flange folds. So it only had to be pushed halfway off its seat. When told that the seat was actually 12 inches and not 11, they revised their estimate about how far this girder, their analysis, how far this girder had to be pushed off. They said, oh, well, it was pushed off 6¼ inches. Well, even if all that could have happened, it wouldn't have come off the seat. Why? Because this side plate here would have trapped that girder because it expands, and it's been shown, as I'll show you at the end of this presentation, by Professor Halsey of the University of Alaska, that this side plate would have trapped that girder from ever coming off. Hey, but let's say all that could have still happened. What do we have next? The 13th floor falling on the 12th. And so, looking for a note because I've got an important update for you on this presentation. And the 13th floor falling on the 12th would not have had even a third of enough shear force to impact the 12th floor below and break that shear connection, because there's a girder just like this on the floor below that it would have had to sever those connections in order to start a progressive collapse. Well, that's proven to be impossible by the University of Alaska in a 3-year, $400,000 study by Professor Halsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, in which he shows that that girder would have been trapped on that side plate because it expands as it's being heated up under the NIST scenario. He shows that indeed these beams couldn't have expanded toward the girder at all because they're actually, the heat is causing it to move toward the exterior wall. We'll come back to that. Again, 632,000 pounds required in a dynamic force to break the floor 12 girder, but we only have 166,000 pounds available to do it with. And NIST notches all of their beams and causes their almost simultaneous failure in their computer model in their effort to try to prove their initiation of collapse and total progressive collapse theory. That's how they simulate the fire damage, by destroying all the beams at once. No, fire doesn't do that though, does it? Let's take a look at their animation.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
Does it? Well, let's compare it to the video of the event. Here's the video of the event on the left. The East Penthouse comes down first, sure enough. But then you have this complete release of 400 structural steel connections failing every second. And then this vertical line of collapse, which doesn't even destabilize on the right side of the building. And so they stop the entire animation just 2 seconds into it. They don't even show us what happened. Why? Well, it begins to tip over. It begins to crumple like a beer can. It looks nothing like the video. So they have to stop it. So we'll show you what a real finite element analysis study looks like. But first, let's talk about the scientific method. We've had it in the West for 100 years or so. We have a question: how did the tower come down? Do some background research, make some observations. How have other towers come down? Construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess. Did it come down by fire? Controlled demolition, maybe. There's plenty of evidence for that, as you'll see. We test the hypothesis with experiments, analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. If the results are not corroborated, we go back and we construct another hypothesis based on the actual research that we're doing, the tests, the experimental data. By the way, these results, this repeatability is important. It's based on transparency. Not the kind of transparency we got from NIST, which showed us that they want to hide this material, but based on the uh, uh, we submitted a request for an actual FOIA request so that we could receive the actual input data for the computer. They write back saying, we can't give that to you. Well, why? It would jeopardize public safety. That's the excuse they use. Wait, it jeopardizes public safety, does it not, to refuse to give this important information that needs to be peer reviewed by the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? No, we got to go back and construct the new hypothesis, which is what we're going to be doing today until the hypothesis is corroborated by the experimental data, the research, the eyewitness testimony, etc. Let's begin with a look and see what are the forces that destroy buildings. Certainly, fire can destroy buildings, not high rises, not ever before 9/11, but say in a wood frame building. This is an organic process. Fire, it's chaotic, following the laws of entropy, increasing disintegration, burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes or so. Moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So in a wood frame building, which we have lost plenty of by fire, it falls in stages, over, uh, and hesitating when it meets the cold, hard structure below, and then maybe there's an additional collapse. It's not a uniform, straight down through the path of greatest resistance type of collapse. What about fire in steel frame buildings? Well, guess what? The largest test of its kind was done in the United Kingdom. An 8-story building built just to burn it. Had fireproofed and some non-fireproofed beams in it. Had a huge amount of kindling, as you see here, to simulate the worst case fires. 2,000 degrees they were able to achieve here. Jonathan Barnett says, though, that this is the best test of its kind, but it showed what? It showed that the beams did not fail, even when they were not fireproofed. They merely sagged, as they can do when they reach the critical 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature. So with the summary of this report states that this is an inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. Again, even when the beams are not fireproofed. Well, what about skyscrapers that do have fireproofed? They don't collapse, not in Los Angeles. This 62-story building burning 3.5 hours over 5 floors, the first interstate building. Philadelphia burning 18 hours over 8 floors. Or Caracas, Venezuela, burning 17 hours over 26 floors. No collapse. Not even in China, in this 44-story conflagration in 2009, do we have a collapse, burning from top to bottom. Before on the left, after on the right. Slightly toasted around the edges, remodeled, put back into use. No collapse before 9/11 by much hotter, much larger, and much longer lasting fires in these buildings. Steel framing can sag in a building, particularly when it's not fireproofed, as you see here. They can even collapse if you have a lot of incredible fuel loads, like in a factory, for instance. We've lost some steel frame factories, but they're not fireproofed either. This is one of the reasons that we have 5 fire commissioners led by Christopher Gioia in the Franklin Square, New York area fire district, demanding a new investigation of the destruction of these buildings. First elected body in the history since 9/11 to demand a new investigation based on the evidence that you're seeing today. Now let's look at buildings that do collapse due to natural events, unplanned events. The building is recognizable as a building at the bottom. Remember that, because we'll be looking at the pile of Building 7 soon. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. This is a natural collapse, like we're told Building 7 was. How about buildings that were exploded? What happens to them? Well, we have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds with incredible heat from the release of the gases in these buildings, in these explosions, chemical reactions. A clear line that's expanding outward in these cauliflower-shaped forms with a solid, defined edge. It's not a wispy cloud like when you don't have a lot of heat. So this is caused by incredible heat. You have sounds of explosions. You have they're heard by witnesses. You have flashes of light that are seen by witnesses. Let's look at a controlled demolition where explosions are harnessed quite effectively to bring down these buildings. Because we have only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish this feat. They place thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and detonate them in a very precise order to achieve the results that they want, which often include a free fall acceleration and symmetry. Well, let's look at this set of features that are fairly typical. A sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure, a straight down symmetrical collapse, if that's what they want to achieve, because of the patterned removal of columns. That's how you get that, resulting in a free fall acceleration, as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, or nearly so, if that's what they want to do. But it's certainly capable of doing that, and has in many cases, through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel along that path, resulting in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame and limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. Feature number 7, patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. Okay, this is getting pretty clear. The concrete floors are broken up because you don't want to have to go in and jackhammer those floors later, so you break them up. Normally they don't turn them into powder, but into chunks that are removable by the crab claw excavators. With explosive charges visible at many of the floors, these are called squibs or isolated explosive ejections, and heard and seen by witnesses, and chemical evidence of explosive devices and the residue left behind for all to see. So this is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fire causes structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. Remember that, because that's not what we're going to be seeing here in Building 7's collapse today. With government documentation, you can't just go out and bring a building down in the middle of the day. It takes months of preparation and approvals, of course. So we have foreknowledge of the destruction. People who are aware of the collapse in advance. That becomes critical, as you'll see later on today. Experts agreeing, hey, that's a controlled demolition. Well, at least those experts that are not wedded to their financial and political obligations that might keep them from an objective opinion in the matter like this, such as whether this is a controlled demolition or not. With video documentation, of course, all this can give us proof of controlled demolition. So let's follow this model into the discovery of the evidence in Building 7 and see what we can come up with. Beginning with 1, feature 1, is there a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure. Well, let's listen to Dan Rather as he narrates his opinions about this collapse as he's watching it.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What? Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Dan's never repeated those words since 9/11. In fact, we haven't seen this building come down, with 2 or 3 exceptions, since 9/11. This is the third worst structural failure in modern history. The architects and engineers, the American Institute of Architects has not issued one bulletin on the collapse of this 47-story skyscraper to its 80,000 members, of which I am one. The American Society of Civil Engineers has only pushed the official story of collapse by fire and hidden from its hundreds of thousands of members the truth about the evidence that you're seeing today about this building, its collapse. Feature number 2, is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's take a look here at Building 7. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Interesting. Let's watch it again. This is 6 seconds after the east penthouse came down on the left side. The main penthouse is the west penthouse and screen wall are coming down a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building. Well, wait a minute. We were told that the collapse started under the east penthouse and worked its way across this football field sized building. But if the penthouse and screen wall are falling all of a sudden, that indicates what? That the core columns that are supporting it are failing all at once, which is a complete contradiction from the official story, because fire can't cause all the core columns to fail at once, as we know. So what can? Okay, hang tight. We're getting to that. And it falls mostly into its own footprint. The center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint, as you see. It's a 4 to 6 story pile. We'll come back to that. But let's look side by side. Here's Building 7 on the left, a series of known controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any comparison? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition? Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper in history before 9/11. Should it not have been the initial hypothesis, if not the only rational hypothesis in examination by FEMA and by NIST? But it was relegated to a series of frequently asked questions, very frequently. 6 years later, more than that, after several years after the final report came out in 2008, which is 7 years after the actual collapse, they were juggling this football, maybe hoping everybody would forget about it, because a lot of people did who ever knew about it. But these random fires were said to have brought this massive building down symmetrically. Makes you scratch your head. Feature number 3. How does that happen? The symmetrical collapse of this building. Well, we have 80 columns in this building, 81, and all of them starting with the core columns, had to have been brought down virtually all at once, because you saw the penthouse come down uniformly, the screen wall in West Penthouse. So followed within a second or so after that by the exterior columns. That's how you bring a building down symmetrically. Any deviation from that pattern, and the building would begin to tip over. And these fires are going to allow that to happen. How fast is the building coming down? Feature number 4. Let's listen to David Chandler.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to freefall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Well, the building didn't have zero resistance. I think there was 40,000 tons. Let's listen to a structural engineer tell us about this.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Well, NIST was embarrassed publicly in a press conference by members of AE 911 Truth to admit and acknowledge that it did come down, in fact, at free fall acceleration, which they had been denying for the 7 years prior to that conference. They said, well, gosh, if it was coming down in free fall, that would mean there'd be no structure underneath it. Right. But in their final report, after being forced to acknowledge this, that it came down for a third of its 7-second fall at free fall acceleration, then they don't acknowledge the implications of that. Well, how does that happen? What happened to all the columns? What happened to the structure? How was it all of a sudden not there? No mention. Well, here's a clue. Feature number 5, the total dismemberment of the steel frame. We had a 47-story moment-resisting steel frame skyscraper where the columns and the beams are rigidly welded to each other, most of them. And yet it falls like a house of cards, one column from one beam and every column from each other are severed such that it can fall into a pile about 4 or 6 stories tall. Remember, natural collapses due to unplanned events, you have a recognizable building. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. Is there limited damage to adjacent structures? Yeah, pretty limited. The Verizon building sustained some damage. The post office actually sustained some damage. But the center of this pile is in the center of the footprint of the building. What about the witnesses? Well, here's NIST's Shyam Sunder describing there aren't any.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
Well, let's look at a couple of them. Here is a witness recorded on the radio that day.
We lost in the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
Wow, a shockwave ripping through the building, a sound of a clap of thunder, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. How about Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Well, goodness, is there any more?
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
Okay, and this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, didn't realize that the building had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down, they're going back into this building, and here's what they find. They actually make it up to the 23rd floor, and they're on their way back down, and this is what they experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What sort of sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs, like this one heard on the late morning of 9/11 by these firefighters?
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
How many of these witnesses of explosions do you imagine were documented and put in the final report by NIST? None. Are these credible witnesses? What happens to this testimony? Let's go on, because there was another witness. The Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, 20 miles north, recorded a 0.6 magnitude event, seismic event, near the time of the collapse. NIST says, well, this was the result of the collapse. Let's see. Because applied geophysics expert Andre Rousseau documents in 2009 and 2012 otherwise. He's the author of more than 50 peer-reviewed papers on the progressive mechanical waves in geology. He says, well, hey, let's look at it. We've got a seismic signal at 5:20 in the afternoon in 42 seconds. Okay. And the building doesn't start to collapse, though, until 10 seconds later. Well, what do we do about that? Well, NIST has an explanation. A seismic signal approximately 10 seconds prior to the onset of the collapse was likely due to the falling of debris from the interior of the collapse. Well, wait a minute. The interior of the collapse, we're not talking about the east penthouse, which is collapsing now, 6 seconds prior to the overall collapse, because that's up top. We're talking about the interior. it comes down at virtually the same time, as indicated by the dropping of the screen wall and west penthouse a half a second prior to the overall building. So there's no interior collapse reaching the ground at all until 7 seconds later. So Andre Rousseau, for these other reasons, has a different conclusion. The bell-like form points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. These undeniably have an explosive origin. Wave velocities and frequencies are easily explained if they were created, these seismic waves, by strong explosives. That's quite revealing. And this is also why we have the University of Alaska doing this 4-year, $300,000 study. So they have a problem. Professor Halsey says no other tall frame building ever failed due to fire. So we have to ensure the public safety, that the failure mechanism needs to be understood here. That was his motivation, because there's similarly designed buildings, hundreds of them, throughout the world. So let's get to the root of the problem so they're not subject to falling at free fall out of the sky due to small scattered fires also. So he examines the response to the fire loads using the NIST criteria. He wants to rule out scenarios that would not cause the collapse and identify the type of failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. So he uses all of the same assumptions that NIST uses because we want to compare apples here. But he finds out some interesting things in simulating the structural response to the fire loading using NIST's fire loading data, which he didn't particularly have a problem with. But when he goes to examine their collapse initiation hypothesis, the problems mount here. He simulates several several failure scenarios and to identify what could have caused the observed collapse. So he creates these models in SAP 2000 and Abacus software so that they compare one against the other, and it turns out they were consistent. So NIST's theory of the thermal expansion of these beams pushing this girder off of its seat in the upper right-hand corner here, the northeast, is simulated. And what do they find? They find that the greatest movement is beginning at the fire around column 79, but the movement is pushing out against the exterior wall. These are inches. This is the red is 6-inch movement, and the orange 5-inch movement and 4-inch movement, and so on. So the girder is in this area. Well, wait, they say the girder was pushed to the left off of its seat, but that's not what really happens when you run the scenarios. Well, how did they get that? How did they get that to happen? NIST, they made the exterior wall infinitely stiff, forcing the movement inside. Well, the wall's not infinitely stiff. In fact, it turns out to be much less stiff than the centroid of thermal movement, which is closer to the elevators inside the building. So they do some finite element modeling here, and they find again that the girder would have been trapped by that side plate after expanding. So it couldn't have fallen off. They find that the 13th floor couldn't have destroyed the 12th. They find that the movement at the seat was in the opposite direction, a complete reversal of NIST's own findings. And that the shear connections on several beams were were not broken, as NIST had claimed, that they couldn't have been broken. And that the bolts that fastened the girder to the column were not broken, could not have been broken in their model. So this is the study that NIST was paid to do by Congress, but which failed miserably. And this is their F grade handed to them by a major university study. They found that columns 79, 80, and 81 did not fail at the lower floors asserted by NIST. But if they could have failed, because they took them out and said, well, what would happen if they did fail? The building tips over. It doesn't propagate a progressive collapse down and across the football field sized building. What would they find? They find that it tips over, not straight down when you remove those three columns. And they find that with their SAP 2000 modeling, what brought this down, the conclusion is the simultaneous failure of all the core columns over 8 stories, followed about a second later by the simultaneous failure of all the exterior columns over 8 stories, produces almost the same exact result as they've seen in the videos. In other words, this result here. So if we want to know what happened to Building 7, we have to ask ourselves what can remove 650 columns all at once over an 8-story period. The conclusion is that this collapse is a global failure involving a near simultaneous failure of all 650 columns over this 8 stories, not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns. That fire did not cause the collapse of Building 7. It's not hot enough to cause the weakening of the steel. The thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders. And Building 7 did not experience a progressive collapse, but a global collapse. And you can see and compare the difference here with NIST's on the right computer model, the University of Alaska on the left, the video in the center. Which one looks like what happened that night, that day, that afternoon? Is it the simultaneous failure of 400 structural steel sections, which NIST has to release every second in their computer model, which they still can't even get it to look like the video, and which they stop after 2 seconds? No. It's an elaborate fabrication, a Potemkin village. And you paid for it. And that's why 3,000 architects and engineers are demanding a new investigation. That's why the fire district of Franklin Square in Munson, near Queens, is demanding a new investigation, inspired by the loss of 2 of their own. They became the first elected body in the country to adopt a new demand a new investigation. You better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. Yep, the overwhelming evidence presented in said petition, this is the grand jury petition, which we'll talk about in a moment, demonstrates beyond any doubt that pre-planted explosives or incendiaries, not just airplanes and the ensuing fires, caused the destruction of these 3 skyscrapers. Now, the Twin Towers we'll get to in part 2 and 3 of this series. So be sure to stay tuned and come back on Thursday, Pacific time, 1 p.m. next week to see the Twin Towers. Or search on YouTube. We have several of our webinars up there already. Feature number 8. We're making progress here. Pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete. What are we talking about? The National Fire Protection Association, 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, is the accepted manual for investigating this. And NIST did not follow it, even though they had a hand in creating it. It's used throughout the world. What do they say? Look for large volumes of gas and a large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. If you have incendiaries, you have massive heat. Well, look at the rapidly expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes racing away in every direction from Building 7 after its collapse, expanding and expanding 35 miles an hour a solidly defined edge, cauliflower plumes indicating incredible heat, a whole lot more heat than we see in the fires in Building 7, causing this expansion and these cauliflower-shaped plumes. A whole, maybe like enough heat like what you see here. Feature number 9. Let's look at that heat because it is fascinating and persistent and hot. Here's Building 7 up top, 1,340 degree temperatures at the surface. Well, wait a minute. There's no fire at the surface. What are we measuring? Surely those few small scattered fires were extinguished when the building collapsed. But no, something else is going on here, much hotter, much deeper down beneath the surface, which is radiating up and cooling by the time it gets to the surface down to 1,300 degrees. Well, how hot was it? We'll find out because these hot spots are much deeper down in the rubble. Let's listen to Abelhaz and Astani Azel from UC Berkeley, professor.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
I saw melting of girders. What can melt girders? Temperature's a whole lot hotter than office fires. We'll get to it because he says these are the World Trade Center steel that he saw melting. He took this picture. He's aware of it. He thinks it melted down in the pile, as if there's some force that could do that. Well, the FEMA author of the Building Performance Assessment Report that came out in May of 2002, Jonathan Barnett says steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. What can do that? That's 4,000 degrees, 4 times hotter than the hottest office fires. FEMA produced Appendix C, a metallurgical examination of the steel. What did they find? Never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese. What can do this? The firefighters have never seen this before. It takes 2,800 degrees to melt steel, 3 times hotter than the hottest office fires. Or so. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation. How does that happen? Liquid iron, that's molten iron, and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. No clear explanation for the sulfur has been identified. Where did the sulfur come from? Stand by. They call this the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. New York Times, but it's ignored by NIST. It's not just ignored. Appendix C has been thrown out of the report altogether when NIST took over in 2002. They say, well, we couldn't test the steel from Building 7. There's no steel recovered. The lack of steel precludes tests on actual material from the structure. And no structural elements positively identified from Building 7, which is not true at all, because we will show you a photograph here of John Gross, who was the co-project leader of the NIST report, cutting off the very coupon, they call it, of steel from the Building 7 beam that was handed to FEMA that was clearly identified as WTC 7 steel and that had the silver dollar size holes in it and partially evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, according to the FEMA author, Jonathan Barnett, fire protection engineer. They're caught with their pants down. It's a real problem because the fires are only 1,200 degrees, according to Thomas Iger, supporter of the official story. Hydrocarbons only burn 600 to 1,400 degrees. So iron had definitely melted, as we're seeing here. And here we can tell by the color of molten metal what its temperature is. In this case, exceeding 2,500 degrees, pouring liquid molten metal out of the materials held in the hands of this crab claw excavator. Well, what caused it to melt? Well, let's look at feature number 10, forensic evidence of thermite incendiaries. Could thermite have produced all that metal? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Oh, Richard, we're not hearing you. Richard, just to interrupt for a moment.
Hey, sorry about that. Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
My fault. I put it on mute. So now we're getting here somewhere possibly. We have a possible source for the molten iron, which is issued by thermite. Elemental iron, by the way, not steel. We haven't used steel in our skyscrapers for 100 years. We have a possible source for the extreme heat, which is issued at 4,000 degrees by thermite. We have a possible source for the sulfur, which is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So interesting. Let's go further. Dare we? Because the NFPA 921 says look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials. Well, this says they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, wait a minute. Did you look? This did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you're not going to be looking for, but others did, and it was found. And Stephen Jones is a physicist formerly from Brigham Young University. And he looks and finds, for instance, in the National Peace Park, where the artist sculptor sent a piece of slag to him, and he looks at it very interestingly. First of all, finds out, gosh, this shouldn't have been this jagged edge with this thick slag with aluminum residue hanging off of it. This is what they used at the site. Very effective thermal lances and oxyacetylene torches, and they don't leave this kind of residue, aluminum indicating an incomplete chemical reaction of thermite, which is composed of aluminum, which normally turns to aluminum oxide. So the X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy tests on the slag finds what? Finds aluminum, sulfur, manganese. We'll get to that. Iron, the ingredients of thermate, shouldn't be found on the slag on the ends of the beam. Well, what was found throughout all this powder spread like a river across lower Manhattan, 3 inches thick, mostly concrete powder, by the way, which we'll get to next week. But what was found in it? The U.S. Geological Survey in their particle atlas of the World Trade Center dust, finds these spheres, what amounts to up to 3 tons of this material. They're naked to the human eye. Up to 6% of the composition of the dust is these previously molten iron microspheres. Some estimate up to 10 tons. I think it's more like 2 or 3 tons, but it's more than a whole lot, 150 times more background value of little pieces of iron that can be found in World Trade in all dust. On the left, you see, but it's not spherical. On the right, you have spheres, which R.J. Lee says were formed during the World Trade Center event. R.J. Lee Group is independent, private, environmental consulting firm. There are billions of these things, and there are so many of them. They're used as a signature component to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. So how do you get, what happens when you burn thermite? Well, here's a controlled experiment, a very small experiment. Slowing it down halfway, you already see thousands of what? Sparks, it looks like, but they're molten iron microspheres. They're spheres, the same spheres that are found throughout the World Trade Center dust. And that is proven. By the way, could that explain the toasting of the tops of these cars parked around the World Trade Center? What else could explain this? Molten iron droplets could explain it. So you can make incendiaries from thermate in your own backyard, as the civil engineer John Cole did. And it actually cuts cleanly through a lot of those beams. But there are more effective devices, such as this patented device in 1999, before 9/11, which issues streams of molten iron in just hundreds of milliseconds. So we're talking much more effective at cutting through steel than shaped cutter charge with high energy explosives, which is more typical in a controlled demolition. But why would that want to be avoided in a deceptive controlled demolition? Well, you have a huge audio signature, as Shyam Sunder described earlier, and a huge light flash, whole sets of these things that you would want to avoid in a deceptive controlled demolition. So maybe this thermite idea is not so bad after all, if you want to hide what you're really up to. There are devices that are made with consumable thermite, where all that's left behind is pools of molten iron, which are found in the plentifully, as you'll see 2 weeks from today in part 3 of the series, 9/11, An Architect's Guide. But what else was found in the World Trade Center dust? A team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit, expert in nanotechnology, examines 7 samples collected and sent to them independently, including the one from the apartment from Jeanette McKinley across the street from the north-south tower. Her whole window was blown in and her apartment filled with this dust. It was horrifying. She was there at the time. And she's an artist, so she saved this. She paid for that with her life. She got brain cancer, tragically. But that sample is one of these 4 samples which were documented in a peer-reviewed paper. There's up to 10 tons of this material by extrapolation. That's by figuring how much was in one set of samples. You can extrapolate to determine the amount the largest chip of these red gray chips, which come up to a magnet, so they get real curious and they analyze them. They're not paint. They look like paint. First, they thought they were paint, but they zoom into the red layer and do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy analysis and find that it has what? The ingredients of unignited thermite. In the spheres, we found the signature of ignited thermite. Here you just have the iron and the aluminum. The unignited thermite, that's what thermite's made out of. Iron oxide crystals, or basically rust. Not crystals, but particles, and aluminum particles. So they get real curious, zoom in 50,000 times with an electron microscope, and what do they find? Particles that are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. Iron oxide crystals, aluminum platelets, set in a bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. This is organic material. Organic material is what makes the TNT incredibly explosive and powerful, knocks things over. Whereas incendiaries destroy by incredible heat and molten iron. Well, when they put these in a heater and they ignite, producing amazing amounts of energy at 420 degrees Celsius, about 758 Fahrenheit is when they ignite. And what do they produce when they ignite? They produce molten iron spheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron spheres extracted from the World Trade Center dust by R.J. Lee and the USGS. So we know exactly where these spheres came from. They came from these nanothermite chips. So you see, this is an internally consistent, self-corroborating, repeatable set of experimental data that could be brought into an uncorrupted court system and put a lot of people away for mass murder and treason. That's why this material, everything you've seen today actually, has been submitted to a U.S. attorney and who has agreed, as you'll see, to follow the law requiring him to give the evidence to a special grand jury for investigation. As if we didn't know where these spheres came from. They're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. There's no question. This material was developed at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory and Los Alamos Lab. It works because you've got extremely small particles at the nanoscale, which creates an incredibly large surface area and ignites almost all at once. It's an incendiary designed to become more explosive. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So yes, if there's a will to investigate this on the part of our government, then there are plenty of clues to proceed from. This peer-reviewed paper, for instance, is 25 pages in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, submitted in 2009. It stands uncontested. Nobody submitted a peer-reviewed paper challenging the results of this one. That's how you challenge science, is in the peer-reviewed world. So we've shown so far 10 key characteristic features of controlled demolition and some very uncharacteristic features as well. Direct evidence of destruction with explosives, and particularly in this case, Building 7 incendiaries. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Why? Well, we have, for one, the steel frame conducting directing that heat away from its source. So it never really gets to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit critical temperature at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. But we also put fireproofing on these beams, 2-hour fireproofing and 3 hours on the columns, which is a lot more fireproofing than is needed to protect the steel from the 20 or 30-minute fire, which can occur, because that's all the fuel there is, even as acknowledged by NIST. So we also keep these buildings from being built out of combustible materials. Skyscrapers have never fallen by fire before, and these are the reasons. And we put fire sprinklers in these buildings to keep that from ever becoming a problem. Well, it didn't help at World Trade Center 5. We have a devastating fire in this building, fully engulfed. Did it come down? If any of these World Trade Center this is not a skyscraper, but these buildings were to come down due to fire, you'd expect it to be this one. Did it? No, no collapse. They had to bring it down with cables. Yet these few small random fires brought this building down in 6.5 seconds. Makes you think. For the first time ever. What about the FEMA and NIST reports? Well, we had official investigations beginning with FEMA, which had $600,000 of funding. Their efforts were hampered, though, according to the New York Times. We have no access to the blueprints of the buildings, bureaucratic restrictions keeping them from interviewing witnesses, making forensic inspections at the site, getting crucial information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was a real problem. NIST took over in 2002 and produced their final report 6 years later, with a stated conclusion that fires caused the collapse of this building. Well, wait a minute. What? Truthfully, they say when they started this project, we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. Yeah, we agree. Because the FEMA report says further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve the issue. Unfortunately, for those hoping to resolve the issue, we have a real problem in what was easily the largest and most perplexing structural failure in history. We have 400 truckloads a day within 2 weeks after 9/11, starting with Building 7, hauling that steel away before investigators could get their hands on it and do a proper forensic investigation. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. Prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, fire protection engineer, to cry out, crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. What about the experts? Danny Jowenko, 27-year controlled
Danny
demolition.
Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft een team gedaan van experts.
A team of experts did this, a hired job? How about Professor Emeritus, structural analysis at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology? In my opinion, the building, World Trade Center 7, was with great probability professionally demolished. Kamal Obeid, one of 100 structural engineers, signed on to the petition by 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Does that sound like something fire can do? What about foreknowledge? Wouldn't we know about this building if it was going to come down by controlled demolition? Well, here's an anonymous engineer who's asked by the chief, if we allow it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse? How soon? He said about 5 hours. Wait a minute. No high rises ever collapse due to fire. And you're saying it's going to collapse in 5 hours? Where did that information come from? Who are you? They won't tell us. He's completely anonymous. This prediction could only have been made with prior foreknowledge. Similar to these mysterious construction workers who were walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then saying this.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Move it back. All right, guys. Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Flame and debris coming down? How do they know? What did Kevin McPadden say, former Air Force medic, before he talked about those explosions, which we heard from him earlier? He and others were held back 6 blocks away from Building 7. And he's listening to a radio held in the hand of a Red Cross worker. And he hears this.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
What? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What is going on here? How is it that the BBC announced the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it happened? Listen to this.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Yeah, sketchy indeed. And what happens before at 10:45 that morning on CNN?
In New York, Alan Dodds Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon.
A firefighter rushed by, telling a 50-story. There's no other 50-story building that went down. There's no other building that went down. There were buildings that were damaged when the towers went down. So, if this did happen at that time, the collapse of this building, we would have no videos of it. It would have been obscured by the massive dust cloud released when the Twin Towers had just come down. Maybe it was supposed to have come down. Some theorize that it was a dud. It was supposed to come down and it didn't go off, and that those mysterious construction workers that we heard from were going back into the building to fix the dud. Well, that is speculation. And another interesting point to add into our awareness is this statement from the owner of the World Trade Center, Larry Silverstein, who had built Building 7 in the 80s, but who had acquired the rest of the World Trade Center complex just 6 weeks prior to 9/11. Put massive terrorist insurance on it, and with $125 million investment of his own money, actually 15 million, which was leveraged to 125 million, which was then leveraged by other people's money to 3.2 billion. He secured this and walked away with 5.68 billion, which he didn't have to share. So, fascinating little history there, but let's see what he says a year after 9/11.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it, and we watched the building pull. We watched the building collapse. Well, he says, well, I didn't mean pull the building. I meant pull the firefighters out of the building. But guess what? The firefighters were not fighting fires in the building. And that's not how you refer to firefighters. Pull it. Anyway, there were no firefighting operations taken in by the FDNY in Building 7. They were told it was going to come down. It had structural damage, so they didn't even fight the fire in the building. So with what we've looked at here, do we have a hypothesis that's corroborated? You get to choose. This is where your analysis comes to some degree of finality. Hopefully, we've given you enough information with 10 key characteristic features and mostly uncharacteristic features, particularly incendiaries, features of controlled demolition, none of which can be accounted for by fire, all of which support the hypothesis of explosive destruction, especially when supported by circumstantial evidence that we've also looked at. Is that to you proof of controlled demolition? Well, let's ask, and you can answer, because Andy has a way for you to ask your questions. And how do we do that, Andy?
Okay, please submit any questions that you might have in the same input form, and we will do our best to answer them. And that's the input form on our website. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Excellent. Well, and do that there. And here you can subscribe to our newsletter. We put out lots of evidence and the efforts and progress we're making toward getting a real investigation. You know, every week you'll get something from us, and it's usually, you know, good news that we're making all kinds of progress, as you've been hearing about already. But we want you to get informed also. Go to the website. The evidence section is extraordinary, full of videos and reports that you can learn about. Sign the petition. Join the 3,000 architects and engineers. If you're not an architect or engineer, you can be one of the 20,000 supporting just by signing the petition. And if you are an architect or engineer, please definitely sign that petition. You just need a diploma that says engineering or architecture on it. And donate to our worthy cause here of waking up the American public to the scam, the hoax of the century, the crime of the century that has been done to all of us here with our tax dollars and murdering that 3,000 Americans. You can donate here on our website. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization trying to get the word out all over the country. Right now, we're sending the Halsey study of Building 7 from the University of Alaska all across the country to every structural engineering college and ASCE chapter. Become a member of AE. Join the sustaining family of membership so you can keep us going. And we have a staff of 5 that is busy full time making all kinds of efforts such as that and visiting conferences all over the United States to awaken engineers and architects. We just went to Washington, D.C. to wake up our sleeping congresspersons. We had 17 appointments with offices there, taking Christopher Joya with us from the Munson Fire District in his full uniform, and Bob McIlvaine and uh, father of Bobby McIlvaine, who you'll be hearing about here. And we need your help too. We've got lots of things you can help us with, right, Andy?
Absolutely. We've got a lot of great people out there who just have a few hours a week. They can do any time, or they can do anything with that time, but they decide to help us and get the message out about the information that Richard has been talking about in the last few hours and in the last decade, and about the World Trade Center 7 study. Help us with our outreach to Congress on so many fronts. And you can be a part of that team as well. If you've got some talent, something that we could use to further this message, some way to just donate your time and do whatever you can to get the message out. We want to hear from you. So go to ae911truth.org. There's an option at the very top that offers you the chance to get involved. Right from there, you'll see the volunteer form. You fill it out, very short application. We'll get in touch with you and get you an assignment and get you to work in this very important mission. So please do that.
Absolutely. And there's a couple other points here. These are the teams you can join, but you don't actually have to join us. There's a lot you can do on your own. Send out our materials from our store. A lot of it's free online. You can just download it. Send the links to the free YouTube videos to elected representatives, television, radio, newspapers. Tell everyone you know. Screen our DVDs, share them, and the brochures one-on-one. And take the Halsey study and send it to your local structural engineering or civil engineering or math or physics university. You've seen enough material already to cause you to seriously question. And we've brought that material to Washington, D.C. What do we do, Andy?
Well, we had a number of meetings with a number of representative staffers and a couple of representatives as well. We've actually got a bulletin going out later talking about this, and we covered this on my show. So a lot was done in those days, and a lot of great information was shared with those representatives. We realize it's only the first step towards getting this right here that you see in front of you on the screen passed. This is called the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. It is named after Bobby McIlvaine, who died that day from an explosion as he was entering the North Tower. That's not part of the official report. His father, Bob, has worked with us for years, will continue to keep working with us to get this bill passed, get information out about how his son died and about how these towers came down. And what this would do is it would establish a select committee. It can be passed in either house of Congress that would do exactly what we've been asking Congress to do, which is investigate the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center towers. And the great thing about this is they can't just get a few NIST officials in there to regurgitate what they've already put on paper back in the early 2000s or late 2000s, 2007. It's actually written in such a way that they have to look into the information that Richard's presented and look into the possibility that explosives brought the towers down. So we need everyone to get involved in this. We've put out calls for people to meet with their members of Congress. You can do that at any time. Schedule those meetings. You can send them a letter by going to ae911truth.org/justice. All you got to do is put your address in, and the computer will figure out who your representatives are. Generate a letter to them. You just got to hit send, and it will send the letter in your name to the member of Congress. So it's very simple. And if you want to keep updated on our mass actions that we do from time to time, you can text 911 Justice to 797979. That way you'll be put on our list to receive the text messages. And sometimes we'll say, hey, call Congress today. Very quick phone call. And a lot of people doing that has a massive impact. So again, politicians don't respond to anything unless they hear from their constituents that this is a major issue that their constituents are concerned about. So get involved. Go to ae911truth.org/justice and ask them, your members of Congress, to pass the Bobby McIlvaine Act.
And they will also be inspired by the fact that the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan has agreed to hand the evidence to a special grand jury. And our attorneys at the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry have done that on our behalf, submitted these 57 exhibits, much of which you've heard today. And they are powerful and on a roll. So you can ask your local representative, elected representative, what are you going to do about this? This has been submitted to a grand jury. Are you aware of this material? Have you submitted? Will you introduce the Bobby McIlvaine Act based on this information and based on the information in our landmark DVD, where we've included 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence. Take a look.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yes, you need to see the whole thing. It's an hour and a half. Hey, it's free on YouTube. You can get the DVD also on our store. We also have a 50-page booklet that we encourage you to get a hold of. And that tears the rug out from underneath NIST, as if we haven't already. But here it is in writing, and it's easily read. It's not too technical. We also have our 2-hour lecture, our research edition of 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, available on YouTube and in our store, and the 15-minute DVD just on Building 7, which you can more easily perhaps, get your elected representatives to watch, or somebody that just doesn't have a lot of time. Well, let's answer some questions. What do you think, Andy?
Yeah, we're going to take a lot of them today, and a lot of good ones. First one asks, if NIST can explain the complicated sequence of events that they say happened on the interior of Building 7, then why can't they explain the symmetry of their alleged outside shell falling and explain the 2 1/4 seconds of free fall on their graph?
Well, they don't want to. NIST does not want to explain the reality of what's going on here. That's why they have to obscure it. They are caught between a rock and a hard place. NIST's job is not to tell us the truth. They've made that painfully obvious. And so we've had to hire, with our own money, thousands of supporters, $300,000 to which we're still paying for, by the way, or trying to. So encourage you to help us with that $50,000 balance if you have the means. But we have paid for most of it, and we've got the report, and you can get it on our website. It's at ae911truth.org, and it shows very clearly that none of NIST's, well, most all of their assumptions are fraudulent, and their conclusions along with them. So now, if you're asking me to speculate on NIST's motives, I would only refer you to other works that have been done by David Ray Griffin, who's written 11 or 12 books on this subject now. Kevin Ryan, who's written another 19 suspects. Those who perpetrated this hoax upon the American people, the people of the world, are very serious about what they've done and why they've done it. And we're technical and building professionals here, architects and engineers. We don't like to speculate beyond the realm of our technical expertise and the evidence as it's given to us by official sources in most cases. So this is where you have to take off and do your own research. And it's alarming, I'll admit. It's bothersome. I was angry when I became aware of this evidence and the implications of it, which we're not naive about. Obviously, this is some vast conspiracy at very high levels of government. You have to figure out yourself how that could come about, how they could get away with it. We can help you in some respects, such as the fact that Ace Elevator came out of nowhere to get the largest modernization of elevators in the World Trade Center towers the 9 months prior to 9/11, which gave them complete access to the core columns and beams in the building, which are immediately adjacent to the elevator shafts. And they fled when the planes hit the towers. They didn't stick around to help the first responders. That was quite a scandal documented in USA Today. But the modernization itself is documented in Elevator World 2001. So I encourage you to do your own research and dig into this. And it'll help you to then be willing to digest more of the technical, irrefutable, scientific forensic evidence. Okay, Andy, I beat that one to death.
Yes, with good information, though. The next question is, NIST says all the floors at the east side of the building from floors 13 all the way to the 47th floor collapsed all at once. Wouldn't all that force be like a bomb when it hits the ground floor and destroy the outer columns in the area, where we would see those outer columns falling before the rest of the structure?
Well, you'd certainly see the exterior perimeter structural steel framing system deform in the video, as it did in their animation, which they couldn't even model manipulate the model enough to get what we actually see in the video, they claim that this progressive collapse started with column 79 after the girder fell off its seat. It's unbraced for 9 floors after this progressive collapse of 9 floors. And that the interior, and their video shows this, the east half of this building, east third of it, is falling all at once, gutting the inside of it. Yes, that would have caused massive deformation of the exterior. So none of it could have happened, and is proven by the Halsey study. I hope I answered that. Did you have anything else you wanted to add on that, Andy?
No, I don't. I think you covered it. If it didn't satisfy the questioner, they can certainly write to us at info@ae911truth.org, and I will be happy to follow up. Do architects need to go to universities such as Alaska Fairbanks in order to become architects? If so, then how can the AIA refuse to allow credits for your webinar courses?
Architects are trained by universities that offer architecture degrees. Mine's a 5-year degree, for instance. We then need 3 years of internship when we can take the test. Take the test, we pass it, we become a licensed architect. And then if we want, we can join the American Institute of Architects and become one of 80,000 architects that have AIA after their name. So we have credibility. Structural engineers have even more relevant credibility. We have more than 100 signed on to our petition demanding a new investigation. So why won't the American Institute of Architects allow us in anymore? Because we've already done 8 presentations, gathering a lot of interest and energy among the architects. So finally, they just said, look, our missions are incompatible. I got a letter from them, and it says, you're not welcome to come this year to our exposition and have a booth, a 10-foot by 10-foot booth where we show Building 7 coming down, the Twin Towers coming down. It's really quite educational, as you've seen today. Every architect who sees Building 7 coming down on the TV at our booth stops, everybody stops, and looks at it and go, hey, that's a controlled demolition. When did that happen? And we go, well, as a matter of fact, that happened on 9/11. What? That doesn't look like a twin tower. Nope, that's the third tower. You didn't know about it? Well, surprise, surprise, surprise. The American Institute of Architects did not issue one bulletin on the third worst structural failure in modern history. We, the architects, are the ones that specify the fireproofing that's supposed to keep those buildings from falling, collapsing in a fire. So we're directly responsible in that way. So we've also been denied, we've been denied access to present as well to the architects. We've done everything we can with them. We've tried to educate them, 400 of the top managers in AIA through the annual business meeting, presenting a case for a new investigation. And we just kind of met a dead end there. And there began to be a lot of ill will. So we now have engineers fanning out across the United States, presenting at local chapters of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And they are having a lot more success, interestingly enough, with engineers who are more interested in huge failures of structural failures of buildings. And so we're going to Miami. We're sending 4 engineers to Miami to the largest ASCE conference. And we're trying to raise funds for that. And we could really use your help. On our website, there's a donation page for it. And I encourage you to support us there at ae911truth.org so our 4 engineers can go in November. So we're, or is that already in October, Andy? I forgot the date actually now. Spaced out.
I don't have the date in front of me. I can look it up probably really quick, but that is coming up, and we did put out the bulletin the other.
Yes, and we need your support for that. So anyway, I rambled again. Let's go back to you, Andy. More questions?
Certainly. The next question asks, the FDNY said there was a bulge protruding outward, the outer wall, but NIST says the outer walls were not pushed outward. I am confused.
The FDNY said that an engineer put a transit on the building and that there was a bulge in it, i.e. some structural problems. This has not been confirmed by anyone else, and it's not visible in any of the videos or photos. It is consistent with the story they put out that there's structural damage, and therefore we don't want to go in there and fight the fire. So perhaps it was a supporting element of that official story, or that developing story that day, to keep the firefighters out of there so that they could bring the building down without further damage or tragedy to lost firefighters. So it may be the same engineer that guessed correctly that the building was going to come down in 5 hours. I don't know. We don't have the name of either of those engineers.
So our next question, and before I get to it, the ASCE convention runs from October 10th to the 13th. So that's why our goal is to raise the money to be able to purchase, because it costs a lot of money to get these engineers that we're sending actually into the building, and plus travel, and they have to stay somewhere. So our goal is by the 7th to raise the funds for that. But the convention will actually run from the 10th to the 13th, according to the ASCE's website. All right. NIST claims there were independent researchers who were involved in the Building 7 evaluation. Were they allowed to see the information that would jeopardize public safety?
Good question. I don't know what NIST got to see relative to that, but the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth did not, and any other architects and engineers were denied the ability to see the computer input data, because NIST had used their only out with regard to the Freedom of Information Act, which was that if it jeopardized public safety, we can say no, you can't have this information. Well, again, it's the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety. We really need peer review of these structures, of which there's probably hundreds of similarly built throughout the U.S. And we've got to get to the bottom of it. Did I answer that question faithfully, Andy?
As well as you can, considering the situation itself is so ridiculous. And that's sort of what happens when you're presented with a problem like this that we're facing with NIST, and the official story is that you can't explain some of the things or some of their reasoning. And I feel that they have a hard time doing that as well, which is why they don't like to interact with us very much. But yeah, releasing the data on a building that no longer exists somehow jeopardizes public safety. I guess in this mind that makes sense, but for the rest of us, it doesn't really. The final question is, will the other American universities have a look at the UAF study, or do they have a choice not to review it?
They certainly have a choice not to review it. And we are certainly adamant that they're going to get it in their hands physically, all 126 pages of it, so that they can. And this is going to every dean of every Master of Science in Structural Engineering university. There's 50 of them or so. We're certainly going to do our best to get it to the state chapters of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and hopefully the local chapters too. You know, it's terribly expensive to print a 128-page study and mail it to dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of places. If you'd like to help us do that, that's also our current and urgent effort. In fact, you at home can download the study, print it, and walk it to the nearest architecture and engineering, preferably a large engineering firm or AE firm, certainly your elected representatives, and others who would understand this material. And certainly, we have DVDs that are appropriate for elected representatives and firehouses. So that's upcoming too. Lots of opportunities that you alone can do.
Absolutely, and we will be reaching out to other engineers. We're not going to just say, hey, here's the study, it's over, and be done with it. We are going to be reaching out to engineering professors, other engineers too. I choose sometimes to keep how we're going to do it kind of secret until after it's done. There's some people that don't like what we're doing. Go figure. So I don't like to put it out there until it's finished, so there's no interference in that. But there are plans to continue this outreach and inform just about every engineer that we can about what the study has revealed. And that is actually our last question today. So for my part of it, I want to thank the audience for the very engaging questions and for watching and for your continued interest in this issue, which is still important. Even though we're 18 years later, it still affects our world. So thank you for always being there. Richard's muted.
Oh, that's terrible. We have today we were looking at, I'm going to show you this slide here, and am I close to it here? There we go. Part 1, World Trade Center Building 7 of our 3-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. Guess what? Next week, Thursday, 1 p.m., we'll be looking at 9/11, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. We'll review the explosions that are occurring, the sudden near free fall collapse of that building, both of them, the high velocity lateral ejections, the shattering of the steel frame, midair pulverization of 90,000 tons of concrete in each of the buildings, and the distribution of 4-ton, 8-ton structural steel sections outside the footprint. We'll ask ourselves the question, if 99.9% of the steel is ejected outside the footprint in a 1,400-foot diameter around each tower, and 99.999% of the concrete is blown to powder and strewn throughout the Manhattan area from river to river, then what's left to crush the building? Think about it. That's the question we're going to be looking at in some detail. Twin Towers and extreme heat comes up in 2 weeks from today on Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific. We'll look at the high-rise fires in more detail. Pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, and thermite, nanothermite, which we only touched on today. So come back and join us. And until then, again, thanks everybody for your great support, and do what you can out there. Help us. This is a grassroots movement. Not getting any help from the top. No corporate funding here from the National Petroleum industry, right? We got nothing but you, our supporters, and that's a lot. It's helped us to get this far, but we've got a lot farther to go. So join us. Thanks a lot. Bye for now.